Hello and welcome to Give and Toke, the show that elevates the conversation about cannabis to a higher level. I'm your host Paul, and today we welcome Talmage Herbert, who began working for RUA Bioscience in 2021. With strong familial ties to RUA's growing region, he first started as a cultivator and is now managing supply chains and partnerships. RUA Bioscience supplies GMP-certified medicines to expanding markets including Europe and Australia, backed by its Centre of Excellence where they incubate superior genetics, including exclusive legacy genetics, sharing New Zealand's rich culture with the world. The company's mission is based on their founding principles of integrity, innovation, health, and collaboration. RUA is unique in prioritising community well-being with tertiary scholarships, community tours, and compassionate access. If you like what you hear on today's show, be sure to follow, like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star rating and review on Apple or Spotify. Those ratings really go a long way in helping this show reach more listeners. If you'd also like to check out our merch, visit giveandtoke.com.au and use the code WELCOME15 for 15% off your first purchase. But for now, please enjoy my conversation with Talmage Herbert. Talmo, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here.
It's a real pleasure to have you here, man. So, look, too many people focus on the rivalry when it comes to, our across-the-ditch cousins in Australia and New Zealand. What is something that every Aussie should do when they visit New Zealand?
I think this is my bias showing, but come to the coast. Like we're positioned. We're on the east coast of the North Island. It's a region called Tairāwhiti. Population's pretty small, especially for the area. And it's not normal. It's a little bit off the beaten track of typical tourism of New Zealand. It's really only the brave or the most, only the most serious tourists really kind of make their way around here. But there's just so much beauty around here, man. Like I honestly can't emphasize enough. You see the type of like promotional or marketing material that the company releases that shows like the region. That barely does it justice. You honestly just can't match it. I remember this is obviously going down a little bit of a tangent, but I'll be quick with it. My wife and I, we were in Vietnam a couple of years ago on holiday and went to Da Nang, which is like a real typical tourist destination for people who want to go to the beach. It's a coastal town, coastal city. And we found incredibly strange, man. We're so used to being up here where you go to the beach here and you don't see another human being. You have your own, the first thing you do is you start piling up driftwood to light a fire. And so I think for a lot of people, they're just what we see as normal for a lot of people in this world is really kind of special. And there's just no way to do it justice other than to say, like, come here and do it.
I haven't yet had the privilege to visit myself. My wife's been over a few times and always raves about it. And having lived in Vancouver, British Columbia, in the hub of that nature and, being able to get away from people and just be in awe of the environment, I think that's what I expect to see in New Zealand. So I've got to get over there and experience it, man.
You 100% do, and you need to tell me when you plan on it. If you're coming as close as Mount Gisborne, I'll get you the rest of the way. Driving State Highway 35 is probably the country's most well-funded 4-wheel drive track.
Right on.
It's not. It's an actual state highway. But but if you don't got a Hilux, you're pretty damn brave. So if you ever come to New Zealand, you make sure you let me know, and we'll get you to the facility. You come meet the team. I think you'll leave feeling a special way.
You got yourself a deal, man. I look forward to that. So let's talk about your kind of lead up to working at RUA. So you started at RUA as a cultivator. Today you manage supply chain and partnerships. Let's go back a little bit further and talk about how you got to this stage. How did life lead you towards working with cannabis?
Cool. So initially, this goes all the way back to when I was a young fella. So for a bit of context, I'm only 31 now, old enough that you kind of have to think about it, but still really young. And as a real young adult, kind of finishing up high school, I wasn't too familiar with cannabis. Had a lot of mates into it and stuff like that, and so wasn't a complete rookie. But I wouldn't necessarily say I was a zealot. I wasn't advocating. And what I did kind of find, and I know my story is not too unique in the sense of as you transition from that, your teenager entering into this young adult phase, I kind of fell into, I think, a lot of the real common mental ruts that young men can kind of face. And working with the public healthcare system, going through a myriad of SSRIs and working with professionals, managed to achieve some measurable results, but nonetheless, kind of it took a real toll, in terms of trying certain drugs, finding improvements, sometimes finding that made things worse, or improvements in some areas of life, worse outcomes in others. But it was a good kind of, I'd say, about 5-year process that I really tried to work in that system and make it fit for me. However, probably about kind of halfway through that process, it was my mother who kind of just raised the question. She was like, "Have you ever thought of herb?"
Oh,
And
rad.
you got to understand, like I was raised in a really kind of Christian environment, so it wasn't that I had a family that was against it. It just wasn't a common talking point,
Right.
to talk about illicit drug use. And I think your own mother bringing it up really kind of like, man, if your own mum can like bring it up, you really kind of throw the book out in terms of like sensitivities, right? You're like, oh, sweet, I don't got to worry. If I don't got to worry about upsetting my mother, then
Yes.
I don't got to worry about anyone. I don't got to worry about anyone's opinion on this. And so, really, what the blessing for me was is I had some really good mates. My older brother and I we're about 3 years apart, and growing up, his friends, he had his tight group of friends, and my tight group of friends naturally ended up being all the younger siblings of his friends, and so you kind of had these annoying little brothers that got into all the same things their older brothers got into, and it was that kind of friend group, that when I decided, I was like, oh man, I really want to take this opportunity. Can't strike while iron's hot. Let's actually see if there's opportunity here for benefit. I talked with those friends, and I just had such a great support network. These were guys that were going to set me up. These are guys I trusted, and it was just your typical, boys in the shed having a good sesh. And I had such a good support network introducing me to cannabis that it meant that I really got to capture the benefits. And it was just kind of from that. Shortly after that, dude, I was just like, realizing how much this costs, dude, I'm paying for this, like I got some skills, I can learn some things. And it just kind of, the fire just built up from there. Some pots turned into a garden bed, turned into tents, turned into this, and you just went down the rabbit holes and started having a lot of fun. And so for years, me and my brothers, with our mates, we had our cool little thing going on. And we took care of our mates, and it was really same deal. This recurring figure, my mum kind of watching or knowing, because we obviously keep in touch with our family here on the coast. At the time, I was living in Hamilton, in the middle of the North Island. My mum was saying, look at what's going on back home. Look at what your father are up to back on the coast. And we had such a good thing going on at the time. We're just like, Ma, like we're all good. Like we like what we got, and like this works for us. And then it was my younger brother and I kind of had an epiphany one day. We was just like, we really don't know what home's like on a regular Wednesday afternoon. We know home for events. We go home for power wars. We go home for tangi. We go home for 60ths, and we're there for a moment, and all the whānau are around, and we all have a good time, and we all get to reunite and see each other, and then we're back off to our busy lives, or we're back to the city. And so it was kind of that dialogue that I think that triggered my brother Maui and I to go, oh, you know what? Let's get a caravan. Let's park it up on some land. Let's move home. And let's connect. And so we did what was referred to back then as the hemp course. And what happened is one of our founders, Pānapa Eho, he had worked with the local tech institute out on the coast, EIT, and had established a hemp course, which was essentially a sustainable ag certificate with hemp overlaid across it. And what it allowed was for people who are into cannabis to all be in a room together. And that's, to be honest, that's 90% of the work, is getting cannabis people, especially growers, in a room with each other and just acknowledging, going, well, I like growing weed. and that, as soon as that's done, the information can start flowing. And so, although there was a academic element to it, really the network is what was important. And coming home for my brother Maui and I, it was just this awesome experience of meeting people who understood us in ways we didn't yet understand ourselves. And they understood us because they knew where we came from. They knew my grandma in her 30s.
Wow.
And I'm like, I didn't know, she was an old lady, like she was with grandma. And they're like, no, your grandfather, your grandmother, they loved gardening. And it wasn't herb for them. It wasn't, that generation didn't get the same opportunities or have the same relationship. It was the generation after them that you started seeing a lot more, all through that kind of 60s, 70s block, following on from Vietnam. And so, you get to learn so much about yourself from these people who you are genetically related to, who know so much about you. And so I think culturally that was just such a massive learning curve. COVID struck during that time, but all through that kind of mess, I eventually ended up taking a growing role with RUA, and I was just absolutely frothing to take on responsibility. Coming from a little bit more of a traditional marketplace, you in those sort of spaces, you have to do a lot more of everything. You can't just be the grower. You tend to have to be a lot more of the chain, and that kind of exposure meant that when I came into legal cannabis, it was just trying to draw the parallels and recognizing it's a different skin, but it's the same. It does the same part of the supply chain. And so that kind of fascination with the supply side of things is what led to boss man Paul eventually to say, Matt, you seem to really like gobbling this up. I've got some more opportunity for you. Do you want to take it on board? And so it's just been a continual taking on of opportunity, learning, and it's been one hell of an experience, man.
There's so much excitement and enthusiasm in what you just shared, and there's a lot there that resonates with me. I think it's a kind of underappreciated thing, a couple of blokes in a shed being able to have a joint and maybe settle down, on a Friday night rather than ramp up with 40 beers. Like that's, even at 35 is something that's I still greatly appreciate, the opportunity to kind of just slow down, relax, hang out, maybe watch a movie, but really enjoy each other's company. That really resonates with me. But also the fact that for you, this is a family thing. There's a real strong cultural connection there. There's a really strong connection with place based on first your mother's influence, but also where she lives as well. So I guess I'd like to take that and segue into kind of how New Zealand cannabis culture exists. What is it? What does it look like? How is it kind of used today versus where it's come from historically?
Take into account it's a millennial in his 30s, so my dialogue is obviously taken from that perspective. Generally, I find a lot of the more traditional ends of cannabis culture to not be so well organized. It's a whole lot of clanky individual gears that through the sheer willpower of consumer demand manages to work and find its way. And so I think what has been actually a real positive of that, because it is something that I love about the traditional marketplace, is this non-centralized pockets of micro supply sites dotted all around the place. And it leads to downsides in terms of coordination, and it can lead to downsides in terms of people being able to access things, because as we talked about, getting the growers in the room is hard, or getting any members of the supply into a room together and to talk is hard. And so people tend to fall into these really kind of tight veins of supply, and they can be incredibly isolated from each other. But I would say it's tons of small cultural groups dotted all over the place. Cannabis culture here on the coast is incredibly different to cannabis culture in Hamilton. Hamilton's a damp basin that is the hub of New Zealand's dairy sector. You want to grow psilocybin, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
You have psilocybin species growing outdoors wildly in the Waikato from April all the way through probably to October. This is meant because it's such a damp place. And so the cannabis culture over there isn't an outdoor culture. It's indoor, and it's an urbanized environment. So it's discretion oriented and carbon filters. And so that's a very different culture then to when you come to the coast and you want to shoot down to Motueka or Nelson region, where the hemp community has really thrived. And that's when New Zealand hop production occurs. And you'll encounter another culture again. So I think it's tons of small cultures all operating within their own unique ecosystems. It's not this like organized criminal syndicate per se. And it's not to say that those elements don't exist, but people have to understand that herb is like one of the worst products for those type of people to engage in. It's incredibly hard to transport. It takes up an incredible amount of volume. The amount of value per gram is low. And so it's far more hard in narcotics that attracts that type. What holds cannabis up is regular people. And in my time with RUA, I feel like it's hard because we can't flesh out the data, or we can't bring things into the light so easily. But what we've experienced anecdotally is it is regular Kiwis. There are so many regular Kiwis with relationships with cannabis, and it's the legal status that causes it to be this difficult thing to talk about. And so with time, trying to dismantle it, trying to create bridges between these cultural groups, I think is really what's important. And it's not just important because it feels good. It's important for an industry because if you want to have true innovation, you really need to allow these owner operator types to thrive. You need to give them a place. And I apologize, Paul, for how deep I'm about to tangent this, but generally speaking, from a real zoomed out lens, when you apply regulation to anything, to any industry, you raise the barrier of entry. And as you perpetually raise the barrier of entry, it is the smaller operators who are first to fall off of that as a result, because they can't go and spend the OPEX on getting a quality team in place. And so when you apply blanket regulation, it's the smallest people who suffer from that the most. And something that we have in New Zealand, and it was something awesome that I love that your conversation with Tom Forrest that he brought up is, in New Zealand, we have a lot of the regulatory burden actually swayed over the product end and not so swayed to the same degree over the cultivation end. And what that's allowed is here in New Zealand, we have this awesome demographic of small time cultivators that I don't get to see in any other countries. I've gone in, sorry, any other GMP cannabis countries. I've gone to Europe. I've been to Portugal, Denmark, Switzerland, Macedonia, and I've got to see the type of cannabis companies. I've done multiple trips over to Australia, and I feel I've had the blessing and opportunity to really look under the hood. And what classifies as a small cultivator in these countries is huge. And so to see, even just on Saturday, there was in Auckland, a whole lot of licensed cultivators got together. There was dozens of us in a room together. And it's awesome because it wasn't just these small owner operator types. It was cultivators from companies like myself. I belong to a listed company, and you have other growers from other New Zealand companies in the same room having pizza, beer, and maybe a little bit of herb off the side with each other. And that is something, when I saw that, it's just like, this cultural thing that we got going on is important, not just because we all have fun and love each other. It's important because here, amongst our expertise, we can actually talk about real problems and we can start creating real solutions to those problems. And you need the freedom to be able to operate to do that. And so cannabis, with all its legal implications, it gets incredibly difficult to innovate within those environments. And unfortunately, it takes people who are willing to say, you know what, I just don't agree with those rules, or I don't agree with where the politicians are happy to place this. And I am in love with this thing enough, or I think this thing is beneficial or important or lucrative enough that I'm willing to fork out my own capital and have a play in my own garage, or in my, or I'm willing to find the small investors, or for some of these guys, sell my house or loan against my own house so that we can get a small thing underway, and so that we can start showing whether it's our regions or our neighborhoods, cannabis culture. And so there's this really cool, the cottage industry of New Zealand is actually really doing a fantastic job at getting involved with industry at a cultivator level. And I think that's something that as a country, we really need to cherish and we really need to nurture.
New Zealand is often a shining light for what's going on, in things that Australia could be doing better. A few years ago, it looked like that you guys would lead the way towards adult use legalization, and it went to referendum and very narrowly failed. Correct me if I'm wrong, it was practically 50.5% to 49.5% or something. What went wrong? Like when I dig into it, I see the impact of conservative Christians coming over from the US and a lot of funding coming from there. But what was your take on that?
I think, man, I think we could do a whole podcast just on this topic. I think on one hand, going to a referendum, if you look at New Zealand's track record of referendums, you weren't really off to a good start. And now, why it was a referendum was the Green Party had struck a deal with Labour as a result of Jacinda's first term. And so it wasn't that people were at fault. It was just, yeah, I think in hindsight, going through with a referendum meant it's not, you don't got good odds here. Then on top of that, you're then rushing it. And if for those of us who are really into it, when we were looking at the particulars of what they were proposing, it was going to be an incredibly prohibitive environment. And there was likely going to be some variables or some regulations that make some of the things we dislike about GMP or medicinal cannabis seem like nothing. The first point I didn't like was even just the fact that the idea of putting THC limits on it. And me, I have a very libertarian streak in me. There's no doubt about it. And for me, I was sitting there thinking, guys, like, the last thing I really want happening here is for bureaucrats to want to write another act.
Yeah.
Can we please just attach it to something that already exists? And can we try just make another, can we just try take something like our Alcohol Act rather than trying to write a new book? And it's not to say that the Alcohol Act was this shining, beaming piece of like great legislation. It was just like, keep it simple. You want some tax revenue out of this? Let's tax the potency, give us the freedom to be able to do things. The Motueka hop growers, they're not sitting there with crazy regulations that make sure the terpenes don't exceed a certain threshold. No, they're given the freedom to be able to innovate and create cool products. And that contributes massively to the ability to be effective in the market globally. And so I did think there were some elements in there that were a bit tricky. However, look, I will say this, how often can you get 49% of Kiwis to agree on anything?
It's a good point.
Take into account too, when it comes to voting in New Zealand, and I'm sure there's similar trends in other countries, especially Western countries, your boomer voter base is an incredibly politically active voter base.
Yes. Yeah. They've got all the time in the world to listen to bad ideas and then go and act accordingly.
and your millennial and Gen Z voter base are kind of the opposite. They don't get involved too much. And the referendum was great at getting a lot more involvement from those demographics. However, you're still kind of cold starting an engine. It's this particular piece of legislation. And remember too, at the time, there was actually two referendums that voters had to vote on. There was the end of life.
That's right. Yeah.
Bill, I may have got the
right
name
to
wrong.
Die, or that kind of thing.
Yes. And so you had two really important talking points that were at completely different places. There wasn't any overlap. And so a lot of voter brain power or time needed to be committed to understanding both. And I felt going into that election, I felt incredibly uninformed on both. And this is coming from a guy who's an incredible nerd on the legislation for the cannabis side of things. And still, I was like, man, there's a lot of gaps here. I really don't feel like I understand how this market is actually going to be.
I think you've raised a really good point there that I haven't actually considered. And I remember at the time feeling a little bit like I loved on one hand that there's a referendum that's being put to the people, put it out there, see what the people decide, see what the will of the people is. But you raised such good points about education and being informed. Are the people informed enough to truly make this decision? And the more we learn and see, the politicians who we elect to make decisions for us have at their disposal all the information and data they need. In a way, you could actually see it as a little bit cowardly to put it to a referendum and not just be bold enough to go, this is a platform we believe in, this is what we're going to roll out. Something that has become apparent for me kind of since Thailand did what it did is maybe we need to go into this with a lot less regulation. Like you said, I think a lot of these acts come in, Canada's is a great example. It's just so strict and it's so restrictive and it's so hard to do business there for multiple reasons at every end. Thailand has kind of showed us that the sky doesn't fall in even when it's just kind of done without regard.
We were in Thailand a month after they went legal. And dude, it was wild.
Yeah.
Like, and look, wild in great and bad ways. It was wild in the sense of how easy it was to find access. And it was wild in terms of product quality varied massively from place to place, and so there are ups and downsides. But what you're watching is just the market in infancy finding itself. And I would argue that sort of a marketplace can find itself in the sense of it can find its consumers, it can find what consumers like, it can form its community, it can get market feedback incredibly fast. And one thing that's difficult with I just keep referring to it GMP cannabis, but these medicinal cannabis markets that spring up in the likes of UK, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, a thing that can be really difficult is two parts. I think one, the regulatory burden, or like the regulatory impacts on innovation, and then two, the cultural impacts on cannabis. Our ability to be able to communicate within these organizations honestly and openly. And I constantly will come up against people that have far more of a pharmaceutical mindset of things. And those people are incredibly important. And they're here and they're a part of this and they're not going anywhere. They're in place through legislation. So culture can dislike them all they want. They are here and they are a part of this. And so get used to working with them and get familiar with those sort of people. However, it does create a sticky dynamic with our ability to communicate, because you can have companies, and I definitely sense this early days, like early days of industry in New Zealand, definitely have seen remnants of it in Europe and Australia, is I've come across so many conversations where talking about cannabis in a lens where you like it is too ricky.
Yeah.
That's too rec, or that's it. And it's just like, guys, like I get it that pharmaco or the pharmaceutical industry and its culture has been well established and has existed for a long time and has good reason, whether it's for its standards. But understand that what cannabis is and where cannabis comes from, at least in the offset, is so incompatible with what you guys have done with all other drugs. And I think you had a lot of Gen 1 people coming into industry with resumes that had Purdue on it or Janssen. Yeah, had these names of big companies, and they came with a mindset and quickly had to realize that, pharmaceutical companies can have their culture, but that's coming into contact with cannabis users. And cannabis has had its culture for a long time. It's not a case of cannabis was unknown or it was in the underground, and now through medical, it can be brought to the light, and the medical industry is going to enforce its culture onto things. It's just like, no, you will or have been turned into a large effective box ticking exercise. When I'm getting products into market, I will meet your standards, but I will not look at your standards as the Bible on telling me what good cannabis is. Good cannabis has been fleshed out and discussed amongst the community for a long time. I will instead look at your standards as safety standards. I will look at it as things I need to meet to ensure the safety of patients. And I will take that seriously. But when you want to have a discussion about good cannabis, when you want to have a discussion about product dev, I'm going to my growers. Those are the guys I'm going to have a conversation with. They're the ones that we're going to vibe out. We're going to discuss in that conversation. We're going to talk about good weed. We're not going to talk about compliant weed. They're two different things.
I like that. And I think it's important for people to constantly understand the intersection of cultures. On one hand, we need the legitimacy of the pharmaceutical industry to kind of make this mainstream, to make it accepted. That helps destigmatize. What they bring to the table does help that. But on the other hand, you've got all this culture, from all across the world, hundreds of years, thousands of years dating back to China and India and Afghanistan. So it's important that the two can intersect. We need people who are from the legacy market to go, yep, I need to compromise a bit here and meet with the suits. And we need the suits to respect and understand that these people who have come from the culture are going to do things a little bit differently. You can't have it one way or the other. We're kind of going to need an intersection of both with a deep respect for culture.
100%. And what you've said is actually made me think about how grateful I am that we have individuals in this industry like Tom Forrest. In the conversation you guys had, is you get a glimpse of these people. And another longtime mentor and friend of mine, Jeremy Plum, out of Oregon, just these incredible figures at not just understanding culture, but being able to talk to that business end, to the suits, to the corps, and being able to help and build bridges between these demographics. Just incredibly important people to the future.
Great point, and great people that you've referenced there. Tell me about what access in New Zealand is like. What is the process for someone to become a medicinal cannabis patient, and how easy is it for them to get, good, reliable cannabis consistently?
So in New Zealand, the way the regs work, any GP can prescribe cannabis. I believe 2 nurse prescribers can as well. However, in saying that, we, like most countries, have a very difficult time getting ordinary GPs to be open-minded towards it. And so cannabis exists under what's referred to as a Section 29 medicine. That's just that section just is a category assigned to all these unapproved medicines. But nonetheless, any GP, your family GP, can prescribe. And because of that difficulty with uptake of the GPs, what you see is the specialist clinics have really come in to fill that void. So for folks who feel or have experience with their own doctor that they're not comfortable or confident to prescribe them cannabis. It's the specialist clinic in that you're able to have probably a bit more open, less stigmatized, comfortable conversation with the GP around cannabis use. You can be very honest with them. I would say the bulk of the market in New Zealand, the bulk of patients are coming out of those specialist clinics.
Yeah, it's much the same here as well. So once they are approved and prescribed, what's access like? In Australia, you can essentially any pharmacy can stock it. That's not the truth that all do. Not all are willing to, but any can. It's pretty easy to get it posted to you and things like that. What about actually receiving the product for patients?
Yep, all the same features kind of exist. We have like really good pharmacies over here that have really done a good job at connecting with community. Top of mind for me is RUA Pharmacy, ran by a pharmacist, James Yu, does an incredible job at caring about patients and being connected. And James is able to ship nationwide, as can most pharmacies. So being able to access even for people in remote areas of New Zealand, you're able to do your consults via telehealth and those sort of services. You're then able to have your cannabis posted out to you. I think it'll come with typical signature required type things. Whatever it takes to kind of meet the insurance requirements. It's rather accessible. I'd say though a key difference between Australia and New Zealand, because of that because of the spotlight of regulation over the product end, it's far more difficult or costly to register products in New Zealand. One way we can, and I'll be bastardizing a little bit in the way that us as Kiwis tend to look at Australia, is in Australia we can kind of bring products into the market and the regulators say, here's the rules, make sure you meet them. If you don't, you're in trouble, right? And we're like, cool, okay, we'll work with that. Whereas in New Zealand, it's seek permission first, and then your product is available to be in the market. And so that can be a far more timely process. You've got to get a lot of batch stability studies done, all that sort of stuff before you can actually start selling into the market. And then the outcome of that is just a far more narrow range of products. So we won't at the moment in New Zealand, you won't see any of these 510 vape carts. Pastilles aren't in our market yet. Hash products, I recall there were some hash products in Australia.
Yeah, we have some hash and some concentrates like diamonds and things like that now. Yeah.
Yeah. So none of that in New Zealand yet. Flower options, I think, in fact, not just flower, but I think Australia's over like 1,500 registered products at this point. New Zealand's like, we haven't even broke 100 yet. So there's far less options at the moment. That will be changing quickly. You're talking with growers around the country. There's clearly a lot going on. There's a lot of intention to get New Zealand grown product into New Zealand and abroad, and especially over to Oz. There's a lot of interest in growers here to kind of showcase what New Zealand cultivation is about. But yeah, just far less options today. But you and I have a yarn in another year. Maybe it'll be a different story.
The impressiveness of New Zealand cultivation can be heard beaming through my conversation with Tom Forrest, as you referenced before. So for listeners, if you haven't heard that, it's well worth going back to listen to why he, an Australian, spends so much time cultivating cannabis in New Zealand and then supplying it to Australia. I'm wondering, is cannabis a partisan issue in New Zealand? Like, has the change in government changed the culture, the regulations, or is the horse bolted and things are already moving anyway?
Just a few minutes ago when we were talking on the referendum, you brought the word cowardice into it or cowardly. And I definitely think that our politicians are hiding behind the referendum outcome, meaning as soon as that referendum was done, Labour, who's our more, obviously centre-left party, they were very much just, look, the referendum's happened, we want to respect that. And I think the same is going on with national. So at the moment, it's a national-led government. It's a centre-right kind of attitude. I personally just don't see cannabis being that much of an important point. And that's incredibly frustrating for me to say. I just don't think that it's in the current government's interest. There's just no upside on a vote from a voting standpoint for them to make a point of it. And I wouldn't be surprised if in our next election cycle, the left-leaning bloc of the spectrum decides to make a clear point about it. However, I don't necessarily know to what extent they'll be able to push that boundary, whether it's another stab at adult use or whether it's a decrim model. I'll be supportive of the sentiment of both, but I'll be incredibly skeptical and scrutinizing of the legislation that they propose.
No, I think that's healthy. I think I think Canada's the really big example of great intentions, but not necessarily the best delivery. Ironically, that's a model that I think could work quite well in Australia. But in Canada, I worked on the West Coast. It moved in and completely stripped everything that Vancouverites and British Columbians have done for 40 years prior and kicked them out in place of, big giant companies. So I've certainly seen firsthand, the people that did the work get dismissed. And we want to be sure that any legislation that comes in includes the people that have brought us to today. Why you and I can have this conversation and publish it and not be in the shadows, why you can work in the industry. We do stand on the shoulders of giants, even though there's still work to be done.
100%, man. And I have a lot of those, well, not a lot. I have some of those giants in my facility. They'll never view themselves that way, but it's been many sessions and much time spent together fleshing out their history. I'm one of the youngest ones. I am the youngest one on site. I think all these growers these are uncles to me, and hearing their kind of backgrounds, hearing whether it's police eradication efforts, whether it's just whatever invasive methods law enforcement's wanted to take, it's just been, I can't think of anything else in society that proposes so much potential upside, so little potential downside, and yet is so heavily attacked over time. And I can think of a lot of reasons as to why, and we could do an entire podcast just on that. But to be able to have the people who have witnessed that with their own eyes, and these guys, I would say OG, and they would say no, we're Gen 2. They're like our dads and our uncles were OG. To think though of what they've witnessed and what they've gone through, and yet here they are. Now they're in industry. Here they are being a part of it. I just think that is probably one of the coolest statements professionally that I've got to make yet. I tend to do way more, but that is something that, really, really happy about. I'm really happy that there's a license with the Ministry of Health, who's got the name of one of my mentors and one of my good friends, who's been about cannabis for a long time, and has the convictions and everything to show for it. It makes me really happy that, as a country at least, for all the dicking around and all the frustration with rules and frustration with legislation, it's just I think that's probably, I need to get something framed. I need some sort of symbol to remind me that's probably the thing I'm most proud of pulling off so far.
I think it's easy to be pessimistic about what doesn't work and what's going wrong and where we aren't. But I think when you've got the privilege to take a step back and look at what we do have all across the world in our respective countries, we are really lucky to be, at the start of history, in the middle of history, whatever it might be. We're doing this work so that other people can do less eventually. We're destigmatizing, you're growing. We want people 20, 30 years down the line to be doing better than us, which is ironic. Off air before, you and I were talking about buying homes. You and I have both recently bought homes, and you look at that and you go, how the fuck is anyone after us going to do this? How is someone 10 years younger than us going to buy a home in these markets? Well, hopefully cannabis is something that is easier for the next generation than it has been for us.
100%, man. And dude, there is no shortage of young people. I say as a young person, I'm not rare. There's a lot of young people with a lot of energy. I've landed across really good circumstances. I've been incredibly blessed, and it's opened up doors, and then I've just sprinted with it. But there is no shortage of hyper passionate young people, and what I'm incredibly excited about, and this is why in conversation sometimes there's frustration with the stagnating on our culture and our ability to communicate can be so frustrating to me, because what I'm just so excited for is a world where our children, and if we have to wait till grandchildren, so be it, but a world where our children are born into markets that are legal, where they don't have to go through that stigmatization process. We're seeing cannabis in their home or seeing their parents use it is no different to a beer or to an ibuprofen. That is a world that I'm incredibly excited about. And we've been in a state of when, not if, for an incredibly long time. And so it's this constant kind of dichotomy of frustration that we can't be so liberated and free about this, but at the same time aware that, look, the trajectory is clear. Is the world got more cannabis or less cannabis? Is it more liberal or is it less liberal? I just think the trajectory on those things are incredibly clear. It's a time game at this point. And we just got to do what we can to put foundations down to support the elements of the culture that we really want to see thrive, and then let time tell the story for us.
One of my favorite things from being a bud tender in Vancouver was I would sell cannabis to like 21, 22-year-olds who had never been to a drug dealer before. So while, you know, we all have those stories of those sketchy motherfuckers we had to deal with far too often in like I had this one guy, his name, and I'll bleep this out from the recording, but his name was so he was a cannabis dealer and a yoga teacher. And one of my best mates is a wheelchair user, and would insist on demonstrating yoga poses for us that might cure his paraplegia. And it's just like, I got to deal with this guy so I can get this strawberry cough and get out of here. Like, I've got no options. So I'm really pleased that the kids today don't have to deal with
Oh my gosh. And dude, and this is such a good example of just like the hilarious stories we all have. There is like for all that, you know, like we can do a podcast, we can have conversations that highlight like the damn injustices that occur because of just criminalizing a plant. But at the same time, we all just got hilarious stories. Yeah. And those hilarious stories, I just feel like I would love for them to just come more out to the light. Like, because we just everyone's got an edible story, and everyone's edible story is 80% the same, but boy, that 20% of difference is hilarious. And I just want to hear everyone's story, you know. And that's how we build culture. That's how listeners have that epiphany of just like, shit, I'm not abnormal. I'm not rare. You know, maybe the people that are closest to me, maybe my family don't see it that way, or maybe, you know what I mean? But really, there's this massive community, and it's why, you know, for all the folklore and inconsistency that platforms like Reddit might bring, what you can't deny is at least it's free to talk, and at least there's dialogue going on, and the solution isn't regulating that. The solution is more dialogue. It's more of these conversations. It's more podcasts. It's more events. It's more products. Like, that is the way at the moment that we have to tell our story. We have to tell our story by talking to great people like you. We have to tell our story by bringing products out to market. Like, that is at the moment what we got. And with time, just more of these awesome, hilarious, and sad stories will come out, and it just, I think that is what culture really is. It's not an obsession with the past, but it's recognizing that you're not alone, and that the legal environment you're in has made it incredibly hard for you to recognize that you're not so lonely.
Talmo, in a moment, we're going to talk about RUA a little bit more in depth, but I want to take a little break from our cannabis conversation and have some fun with a quiz. The quiz is an opportunity to get to know you a little bit better and one of your interests, but also for me and the listener to learn new things. So this quiz is called UFC Some History. This is a sport that I know very little about, man. I've seen, I think, 3 bouts in my life, one of which was that Conor McGregor that was over in like 30 seconds. Like, I went out with a bunch of Irish friends who were, you know, we're going to have the best night. 100 beers were had, 100 joints. It was in Vancouver, so you could do both at the same time. And then the fight happened. It was over in 30 seconds. So that's kind of one of my 3 experiences. I can't even recall the other 2. So I'm going to learn a lot here. So whether you know these answers or not, we're learning together. There's 6 questions here. So let's go with question 1. Going back to the times of the ancient Greeks, what is typically credited as the first combat sport? Is it pankration, aikido, or judo?
Pankration.
That is correct. So it was a mix of boxing and wrestling that appeared in the ancient Olympics. So our combat sports, MMA kind of stuff goes back a really long time.
Yes.
Question 2. Which city has hosted the most UFC events? Is it Los Angeles, California, Dublin, Ireland, or Las Vegas, Nevada?
It'd have to be Las Vegas, home of the UFC.
That is correct.
All right, you're 2 from 2. Question 3. The shortest UFC fight was between Jorge Masvidal versus Ben Askren at UFC 239 in 2019. Masvidal won by knockout in just 5 seconds using what move? A flying knee. Oh, before I even gave you the options. Yeah, that was badass. Like, I didn't know about this bout until I, put this quiz together. And the kind of bravado and confidence as he's leaning up against the octagon, and then he just sprints over, boom, knee, that guy's down. What was that like as a fan?
Well, dude, the lead up to that fight. So what had happened was Ben Askren had come over from One Championship. So One Championship is like Asia's equivalent of the UFC.
Right.
It actually gets a lot more attention from an eyeball standpoint, albeit the UFC belongs in Western markets and there's a lot more economy. So value-wise, UFC is a massive enterprise. And what had happened was they'd struck a deal. They traded Demetrius Johnson, who was the flyweight champion of the UFC, for Ben Askren, who was a welterweight champion of One, and they brought them over. So Ben Askren was I don't know if he's an Olympic wrestler, I think he might be, but just world-class wrestling standards, and ran amok over the One Championship roster as a result of his wrestling capabilities. And then here he comes into the UFC, which is prolific of good wrestlers because it's an American organization. And you got Jorge Masvidal and him just absolutely hated each other leading into that fight. And so for Jorge to win it the way he did, you have to remember that Ben Askren had only had one fight in the UFC at that point against Robbie Lawler, and won in a very kind of controversial way, and had ran his mouth about UFC fighters not being that good.
Right.
And so you had a guy from another organization who had been running his mouth about UFC fighters. He's got one win on a former UFC champion at that point, albeit an incredibly controversial win where he put him in what they call a bulldog choke, and Robbie appeared to have gone unconscious. However, it was a miscall from the ref. Herb Dean mistook it. Robbie was actually fine, but as a result, Ben was declared the winner. Once the ref waves his hands, it's over. And so you went from that. Of course, Ben runs his mouth incredibly hard for another 3 months, and then boom, they give him Jorge Masvidal, and that knockout will never be recreated. You're never gonna get something like that again. It was awesome.
I'm a big fan of NBA basketball, and as I hear you say that, like, I realize that sometimes the drama is as good as the outcome. Sometimes everything that's going on around the sport, and it makes sense why I love WWE as a kid. Just it was more about them on the microphone than them actually fighting sometimes.
Stories are just so important, man.
All right, cool. You're killing it. 3 from 3. Question 4. Which of the following fighters is known for popularizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in mixed martial arts? Is it Conor McGregor, George St. Pierre, or Royce Gracie?
Royce Gracie. Yeah, Gracie family. Really important.
That's right. So he's credited with demonstrating the effectiveness of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu against larger and stronger opponents, which helped establish it as a fundamental discipline in the sport. So that's a pretty cool legacy to leave. Question 5. Mighty Mouse is the nickname of which UFC fighter? Anthony Johnson, Don Johnson, or Demetrius Johnson?
The guy they traded Ben Askren for, Demetrius Johnson.
My ears pricked up before when you mentioned him. I'm like, you better get that one right.
Yeah.
All right, final question. Who is the longest reigning champion in the UFC? Is it Randy Couture, Chuck Liddell, or Anderson Silva?
Randy and Chuck Liddell, they were incredible fighters. They were this early generation of fighter, but no one tore through a UFC roster like Anderson Silva. I depends on your question, but I think it would be Anderson in either case. Is it?
Yeah, you nailed it.
Yeah.
So Anderson Silva is the longest reigning champion in the UFC, holding the middleweight championship for 2,457 days from October 2006 to July 2013. And during his reign, he successfully defended his title 10 times. So that's huge.
Man, I've never been tested on little UFC trivia like this before. I feel so good that I knew the answer to those.
Well, congratulations, man. You got 6 from 6. We all know a little bit about UFC now, and you clearly know your stuff. So thanks for that, man.
Appreciate it, Paul.
Let's focus specifically on RUA now, and little apologies to the audience if they're noticing this in their headphones. My next door neighbor is doing their lawn mowing right now, so we've got special guest comments from that. But focusing on RUA, what is RUA? Tell us about the organization, tell us about the culture behind it, where you guys are located. Tell me everything you can.
So RUA Bioscience, the name is partly inspired by a small community called Ruatoria. It's a township of probably about 700 people. It's where my mum was born and raised. And where we're located is incredibly remote. And all throughout kind of the probably the post-World War II era, you had this massive urban migration occur as a result of job opportunities being sent more available in city centres as opposed to the more regional provinces of New Zealand. My mum was caught up in all of that kind of drama as well. She's a trained nurse, and in order to become a nurse, she moved to Auckland and worked there, met my dad, do nursing. So a lot of families who, once lived out on these parts no longer do because they can't. And RUA Bio, originally called Hikurangi Cannabis Company, was formed with the spirit of what was driving the motivation behind everything was creating economic opportunities back home so that people didn't have to necessarily go. And so that same spirit is what's incentivized and driven all the sort of initiatives from this company, whether it's local employment, whether it's compassionate access, whether it's scholarships, all these sort of things are done because that is the foundation of kind of what started this company. Initially, the company was funded by crowdfunding locally.
Oh, wow.
We went to the community. The founders went to the community, explained, what the opportunity was, what they saw going on, and the community have been a part and been supporters and critics the whole way through. Literally tomorrow, we're opening up our gates. We're doing our community day. It's an opportunity where we open up the gates, bring people from the community in, have lunch together, talk about cannabis, showcase what's going on, really bring the walls down and let our hair down and talk honestly with one another. It's the best day of the year. Weather's shaping up real nice for it. So that was the type of thinking and energy in the room that led to creating this company.
A big mission of RUA is to preserve legacy genetics, and you guys are quite unique in the way that you are approaching the medicinal market with these, I guess, secret genetics, things that don't have the usual pharmacological COAs and things like that. Why is it so important for RUA to preserve these genetics, but also put them into market?
So we're the East Coast region and other regions of the country, cannabis cultivation has been a thing that's occurred for decades, for a very long time. And naturally, as a result of that, you have IP in the form of genetics, in terms of cultural practices. There's all sorts of information and skill set that exists amongst our communities. And, shortly after getting involved with the company, I was fortunate enough to get involved more on the strategy side of things. And in New Zealand, there's what's referred to as a Form D declaration or illicit declaration, and it's a pathway to get genetics sourced from an illicit network or from people who have those genetics. And by informing MedSafe and paying a fee, we're able to then bring those genetics onto a legal drug register, and from that point on, make them comply with the regulations. And so we recognized, okay, we've got this pathway of being able to take in genetics from our local community and wider. And looking at how things were shaping out, I remember saying to Paro, one of my mentors, was, it'd be a damn shame if this region was to do so much with cannabis and to be, because it has a reputation locally within New Zealand. There's a reputation. We have an awesome microclimate where outdoor cultivated product here was being supplied into the country slightly earlier. Gizzy oranges is a big thing, not because it's weird, because it's literally oranges. But the microclimate of Gisborne is such that oranges are going out to market ripe, 2 weeks earlier before everyone else. And so it's like, it would be a damn shame for this reputation to have been formed off the backs of such hardworking and dedicated people, and for us in 20 years from now to be like, there was all this great cannabis stuff going on the coast. Up until that medical thing started, and then it was just kind of all a wrap over it. And I was just like, this what's going on, what our people have done, what they've sacrificed is so important. We really need to contribute to providing a platform so that things can continue. And we don't claim to be the solution to everything. This is just one of many things that needs to happen, but it's just trying to create a platform so that the hard work that people have put into creating medicine for themselves or their community, that there's still a pathway for those learnings or that IP to be relevant going forward into the future.
Reading about the illicit declaration, it seems quite unique. It again, bringing up Tom Forrest, it does seem that New Zealand is willing to support at a cultivation level some serious innovation and some serious uniqueness. You know, I'm going to criticize Canada again. It's a lot of samey kind of products. I remember when I started there, you know, everyone had a Whopper, everyone had a green crack, everyone had, you know, these kind of half dozen same things. And, you know, then obviously heaps of other great stuff. But it seems like New Zealand doesn't want just everyone to do the same thing, that this illicit declaration seems to support innovation in a unique way.
Yeah, dude, 100%. And I think too, another thing that can happen is when you corporatize cannabis, and it's not to demonize corporate interests at all, but it's just as you make legal markets, big money comes. As you do that to marketplaces, what tends to happen is you can kind of like you said, you can whoppify things. You can turn everything into a Big Mac line in the sense of like you have other interests to take into account, such as shareholders and your bank balance, that you can end up having everyone pile in to what's occurred. I feel like out of the States is everything turns into purple candy gas.
Yes.
And that's I feel like that's a reflection of the demographic that most inherits the adult use market. And it doesn't have to be adult use, but it's whatever market allows the feedback loop to be incredibly clear and concise. That market will get incredible insight as to what its consumer base wants, and then everyone else downstream from breeder to cultivator will do what's necessary to appease that. As a result, what happens is, you know, you look at legalization through Canada and even certain parts of the States. For a lot of these markets, it's really the 18 to 30 year olds who kind of dictate the culture of that market at that point. And for a lot of these markets, that was millennials. Maybe later, maybe late Gen X, but really it was millennials. And when I think of millennials as a demographic, you've got this demographic that is kids. The war on fat was really well underway, not the war on sugar. And they were brought up on diets where they're really exposed to a wider range of sweets and sweet tasting things. And so I don't think it's any mistake that here they are as adult consumers of cannabis, and you see that same desire echoing through. And when we talk about legacy genetics, it's not just about having an obsession with the past, but it's recognizing that, dudes, palates change, you know. And I talk with a lot of pharmacists out here. I've talked with compound pharmacists over in Australia, trying to understand, you know, what do you, as a person who's on the forefront of the industry, dealing at a consumer level, what do you see? What kind of habits or behaviors do you see? And to no real surprise, a common feedback I get is that when consumers can, they will want to try lots of things. Culturally, this is another example of something that's hard when you get cannabis culture rubbing up against pharmaco, is that pharmaceuticals are incredibly obsessed with consistency. And it's an incredibly important point, because if you're giving a person an opioid, boy, that consistency has to be there. But with cannabis culture, it gets a little tricky, because for cannabis consumers, variety is an asset. For a lot of consumers, variety is seen as a good thing, and it's not variety within the same product. So it's not to say if you're expecting a white widow to then go and change it on you, it's not that sort of a variety that they want. They want to know that what they think they're getting is what they're getting, but there's always going to be this desire to still taste the rainbow. They still want to know what else is going on. They still want to try things, and then that has to rub up again against this. That looks too recce. They're enjoying it too much, you know, and it's just like this consumer versus regulatory abrasion that's incredibly difficult to decipher. But nonetheless, when we talk about legacy genetics, it's what we're centered on is like, yes, we're aware that there's some things that the market really loves, and there'll be some trends, and we can kind of predict these trends because of what we've watched happen in these other adult use markets. But taste palette will change over time. And just because you see one type of thing really rocky, just because purple candy gas is the thing right now, and that's what the market declares as the shit, it doesn't mean that you don't have other niche markets that want something that's really earthy, or they just want the gas without the candy, you know. And so it's about making sure that as long as we can get good population numbers, and as long as we can take in a good array of genetics, then at least we will have the opportunity to flesh out that pathway. And we don't claim to be the world-class breeders or anything like that, but mate, we got great friends with the likes of PFR, Plant and Food Research, New Zealand is no slouch globally when it comes to its ability to create awesome varieties of produce, whether that's gold kiwi fruit or whether that's our hop varieties. New Zealand has a brand and a reputation and the capabilities to do well there. What we are trying to do is make that library, get that library well established, and create processes so that we can continue to do that. Because we know reaching out into our networks, we've only scratched the surface. There's a lot of people from traditional cannabis that do not trust big companies or legal cannabis. And we need to do our part to hit milestones and show them that, hey, this is a legitimate pathway and we're not here to screw you over. And with time, we can convince them to become more and more open. And it's less about being the innovative hub yourself. It's more about just creating a platform so that innovators can come and be a part of it.
I appreciate that summation so much because it made me think of a lot of things I haven't thought of before, but I think it's also a great wrap up of how hard it is to operate in this market. You know, there are really loud people saying what they want, what they don't like, but you do need to, as an organization, be bold to go, well, I think this product is great. I think this thing should be out there. You know, I've lost so many great products that work for me because they're low THC. You know, the thing that's most effective for my sleep is 18% THC. So is that popular in the market? No, it's not. My favorite daytime cultivar is Mango Haze, which is anywhere from 5 to 10% THC and mostly CBD. No, that's off the market now because nobody wants 10% THC. The problem is that's kind of coming from the loudest people. And for you to say that some of our flavor desires are coming from, you know, potentially our shitty diets is really interesting. I've never thought that before, but I think there's really something to that.
Yeah, man. Sometimes it's not to say it's easy, but I think that some parts of consumer behavior are quite predictable. And it doesn't mean that I'm right. This is crystal ball gazing to a large extent. But if you can make some degree of sense to it, then we can at least start trying to forecast some sort of palettes. We can start forecasting what might palettes want, what might they be in the future, and what combinations of things does the market not yet have. So again, it's about having that playground. You know, when I started in this industry, GMP cultivation was a lot of the talk. Thank goodness a degree of sensibility came into it and realized it actually just needs GACP, but GMP cultivation was nonetheless thought to be the status quo. And watching that take place and the impact it had on teams, you recognize really quickly that because of its obsession with process, and again, important when it comes to the production side of things, that obsession with process just completely took out the knees of innovation. You need to have some flexibility. You need to have the ability to use your nose and use your hands, use your senses, as well as then go get the labs involved, give us some comprehensive COAs. Let's see the chemistry of it. But nonetheless, let's make sure that we never lose track of the fact that the things we used to differentiate good and bad weed of the past are still relevant today. Don't just think that because now that we can involve the labs, that we throw everything of the past out. That's just such a massive mistake. And it will only further fuel a THC obsession. Or whatever analytes the market becomes obsessed with. It starts with THC, then they'll get obsessed with terpenes, and then they'll go they'll go deeper into the pathway. And then you'll have these niche groups that get obsessed with thiols and esters, and this is that predictable pathway of market, and that's fine. That's absolutely good. But let's make sure we've got a good library of other shit ready to come out as soon as the market's ready for it. And that's been a lot of fun because it's a playground here. And so I think I emphasized it before we started recording, but dude, come to New Zealand, come over. We'll come to the facility. You know what I mean? Come get some sticky fingers and an overloaded nose, and see just how possible it is to implement that culture or those things of the past in this industry, because it's not impossible. It's just very difficult.
You've alluded to it already, you know, obviously with the consultation with community and the investment from community, also the educational tours. It's clear that community engagement is a huge part of what RUA do. Tell me about the scholarships, the tertiary scholarships, and also compassionate access. How are you supporting your communities in those ways?
Yeah, so with our rangatahi, our youth, our young people, you know, it was really obvious that there's no shortage of talent, but there is shortage of opportunity. And so what we do is we basically help these kids see how big the world is, and we do that through tour groups. You know, if we've got kids that are close to finishing high school, Get them on the bus, get them on the van. Let's get them down to Wellington. Let's get them in with our partners, whether that's the labs we use, whether that's regulatory bodies we work with. Let's get them inside those places, show them just how big the world is or what the opportunities are. And that's done as an exposure exercise. You then have a scholarship program we do. I think it's 12 kids that we've hooked up with a bit of money. They've either gone on those tours and been exposed or haven't gone on those tours but want to go commit to further study. And we don't cap those kids in terms of what they have to study. We're not there trying to funnel them into cannabis. We're there just trying to increase opportunity. If they want to go do a Bachelor of Arts, sweet, like we'll help you out. So it's really about opening up opportunity. It's not about trying to feed. And the same applies with compassionate access. Initially, we started that compassionate access scheme. It was 30 people, and it's fully funded. So we didn't it's not to shit on people that do this, but it's a lot of compassionate access schemes might be like 50% off for 3 months, and it's like, buddy, that's a sales pitch. That's a marketing scheme. That's not compassion. And so what we've done is fully funded by us. Well, at least the cost of the product, we cover that. It's not limited on product. It doesn't matter if it's another company's product, if it's our product, you're covered. It's not about feeding in our own shit and taking care of our own pockets. It's truly about community. I'd say the parameter on our compassionate access is it's to our region at the moment. And we're aware that there's so much more need outside of our region, and we are very interested in those conversations. But when you're jumping in your car in the morning and you're driving to the facility and you see the poverty in your own community, it sits so much closer to home. And so it's so much easier to be obsessive about taking care of your own backyard. But at the moment, they started at 30. We've now got that up to 52, I believe, is now the cap on that. I want to see that blow up to 500. I want every uncle and auntie out here that wants their weed sorted to be sorted. You know what I mean? That's really kind of we wish that number was astronomical, and it's just a big testament or mihi to all our partners that jump on board. Initially, it was us, Trust Tide Arfity, like a local community trust that helped us out, but we've roped in our accountants, we rope in the lawyers, we rope in our grow partners. Anyone, if there's any trade going on between us and them, it's going to be a talking point.
That's really lovely, man. I had the privilege to speak to someone from All Nations Cannabis based out of British Columbia last year, and it's a First Nations community out there that they are propping up with their existence as a business, but then also going through the processes of providing compassionate access and more specifically education. So across the world, we're seeing some people take some really bold steps to support disadvantaged communities, and there's nothing better than seeing what you guys are doing at RUA. It's really impressive.
Really appreciate it, man. It means a lot. It means a lot being able to talk about it with you. Just really appreciative.
So what's next for RUA then?
Coming up, we are looking to get our genetics out to our different partners. So the model at the moment is to cultivate not at our facility, meaning we've got a small pilot scale facility, remote, like located all the way out here at Uatoria. That's got our genetic library, and we're spitting those genetics out to different cultivation partners in New Zealand and abroad. So products coming off the back of that, that's something to look forward to in the future. But the genetic library, the hunt, the scheming, and the fun, that's a forever project that's going on here. That's a real kind of artistic process. That's a forever thing. But yeah, expect to see products. We have one product available in Australia at the moment. We've used one of our good cultivation partners here in New Zealand to do it, just down in Christchurch. Really looking to do more of that. Like, I can't wait to get more across the ditch. And then as time allows and as our regulatory situation is better understood, you'll then see those products in New Zealand. A common kind of critic I get from aunties is, why are you guys sending stuff to Australia before us? And it's purely regulation.
Because we're bad at rugby and we need it.
That's what I'll use next time. Yeah, that's what I'll use next time. But yeah, I like it, the intent is there. It's purely just regulation. But we'll get those things available to Kiwi soon.
Well, Talmo, it's time for our last segment, and this is called Pools of Wisdom. And though we value the long-form conversation, we try to leave the listener with one key takeaway, dinner party fact, or call to action. So what is your pool of wisdom?
There's a Māori term called tahitanga, and the best English word for it I can think of is unity. The cannabis culture needs to unify, always more. And we've made massive advancements. I love the cultivator demographics that exist here in New Zealand, but we still got so much more work to do. Like as a community, not just as cultivators, at every level. We need more and more unity. There's so much more in common. There's egos in place, and there's investor interest in place, and these things make it difficult. But look, we got to work on what we have in common. And if we have to shelve what we don't have in common for the time being, so be it. As long as it leads to a pathway of more unity, that's what I think cannabis culture needs. And I'm stoked that we're doing some good things here in New Zealand, and stoked to get on platforms like this, because I think that, to Aussie listeners, wish the same too. Get more unified, even though the marketplace might be different. Talk to your grower mates, your mates who's got a tent in the garage. Stay friends, talk about it. You know what I mean? When you find your people, when you find the people you trust, where you can ditch the stigma, make sure you nurture those relationships.
It's been an absolute joy to talk to you today. I can see your love for the plant. I can see your enthusiasm for what you do and your love for your community. It really means a lot to spend this time and hear this story. You mentioned a couple of times there's, full podcasts we can do on other topics. So, and also with you mentioning me coming to New Zealand, I can tell this isn't the last time we're going to spend some time together. So Talmo, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure.
Appreciate it. Likewise, Paul. Thank you.